In the quiet town of Saukville, Wisconsin, the year was 1984. A year that should have been filled with music, young love, and the freedom of youth. But instead, it became forever marked by the brutal murder of a young woman whose story still echoes through the decades. On the night of December 14, 1984, 18-year-old Traci Hammerberg vanished into the cold darkness, and what happened to her would leave a wound on her community that time alone could not heal. Before we unravel this haunting mystery, make sure you hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into true crime stories like this one. Because the story of Traci Hammerberg is not just about violence. It's about unanswered questions, relentless pursuit of justice, and the chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. It was a Friday night in December, and the holiday season had wrapped Saukville in a festive glow. Christmas lights twinkled in windows, carols played from radios, and families prepared for the joyful gatherings to come. Traci, a bright, outgoing teenager, was full of that same youthful energy. Friends described her as fun-loving, kind, and always ready with a smile. She loved music, she loved people, and she carried the spark of someone just beginning to step into adulthood. That night, Traci had gone out with friends to a party in Port Washington, just a few miles away. The mood was light, filled with laughter, and like most teenagers of the time, they were simply enjoying the freedom of being young on a Friday night. Traci spent the evening moving between groups of friends, chatting, laughing, and enjoying herself. But as the night wound down, she made a fateful decision: to walk home. It was the kind of choice that, in hindsight, becomes unbearable to think about. The walk was long, about 7 miles through dark rural stretches, but Traci, independent and headstrong, decided she could handle it. She slipped out into the night, the air cold and crisp, her breath visible as she walked. Streetlights gave way to shadows, the hum of the party fading into silence. Traci Hammerberg was now alone on the road. The hours that followed remain a chilling mystery, pieced together only by fragments of evidence and the cruel reality of what was discovered the next morning. On December 15, 1984, at around 6 a.m., a man named George Burkard was leaving for work when he noticed something in his driveway on Maple Road in Grafton, about 6 miles from where Traci had last been seen. At first, in the dim light, he thought it was perhaps a pile of clothing. But as he drew closer, horror struck. There, in the freezing cold, lay the battered body of a young woman. It was Traci. She was found partially clothed, bruised, and brutally beaten. Evidence made it clear she had been sexually assaulted. The freezing temperatures had already taken their toll, and George immediately called the authorities. What had been a quiet December morning was now shattered by the reality that something unthinkable had happened in this small Wisconsin community. Police rushed to the scene, and the sight that greeted them was harrowing. Traci's body bore signs of a violent struggle. She had fought back, but her attacker had overpowered her. Forensic evidence was quickly collected: footprints, tire tracks, and most importantly, biological evidence. Among the most crucial was semen, preserved by the frigid night air, which investigators hoped could one day be the key to solving the crime. But in 1984, DNA analysis was still years away from becoming a reliable tool in criminal investigations. What they had was evidence, clear, damning, but not yet usable in the way it would be today. And so, investigators had to rely on old-fashioned police work, interviews, and community leads. The news of Traci's murder spread like wildfire through Saukville and Grafton. People were stunned. This was the kind of violence they believed happened in big cities, not in their tight-knit community. Parents clutched their children closer, friends mourned the loss of a young woman full of promise, and whispers of fear spread from home to home. Imagine being a parent in that town, waking up to learn that an 18-year-old girl, just walking home, had been so brutally taken. Wouldn't you wonder if your own child could be next? The investigation began immediately. Detectives worked around the clock, tracing Traci's last steps, interviewing partygoers, and canvassing the roads she may have walked. They spoke to anyone who might have seen her, anyone who might have offered her a ride, anyone whose behavior seemed suspicious in the days following the crime. But the answers did not come easily. Traci had disappeared into the night, and whoever had taken her life had left behind few clues that could point to an identity. And so began one of the most difficult murder investigations Wisconsin had ever faced. The morning of December 15, 1984, should have been just another winter Saturday in Grafton. Instead, police found themselves staring at the frozen crime scene of a young woman whose life had been violently cut short. Traci Hammerberg's body was carefully removed from the driveway on Maple Road, and the questions began to pour in. Who would do this? Why Traci? And how had no one seen or heard a thing? The initial investigation was intense. Officers from multiple jurisdictions, including Ozaukee County and the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, descended on the area. They marked footprints, analyzed tire tracks near the scene, and spoke with residents who might have noticed unusual activity during the night. The cold air had preserved many details, and the forensic team worked carefully, knowing that any evidence could one day prove critical. One of the first things police pieced together was Traci's final movements. After leaving the Port Washington party, she began the long walk home toward Saukville. Along the way, she was likely offered rides. Witnesses later recalled seeing her walking along the road, bundled against the December chill. Some said they spotted vehicles slowing near her. Whether she willingly got into a car or was forced remains one of the enduring mysteries of that night. The brutality of her murder suggested rage but also premeditation. The sexual assault pointed toward a predator, someone who had likely been hunting for opportunity. Detectives considered whether it was a stranger passing through or someone local who knew Traci or at least recognized her. In a small town, that question carried terrifying weight. Police began questioning known offenders in the area, including men with histories of violence or sexual crimes. They gathered names from the community, anyone rumored to have been out that night, anyone with unexplained injuries, anyone whose car might match the tire tracks found near the crime scene. Almost immediately, certain individuals drew attention. One was a young man known for his troubling behavior, who had been seen at parties around the same time. Another was a driver whose car roughly matched descriptions of a vehicle slowing near Traci. Both men were questioned, their alibis checked, and their homes searched. Yet nothing definitive tied them to the murder. The frustration grew. Back at the lab, forensic testing focused on the biological evidence recovered from Traci's body. The semen sample was preserved, but in 1984, the best investigators could do was determine blood type and a few other biological markers. The sample did narrow the suspect pool, but not enough to produce a name. It was like holding the answer in your hands but not yet having the key to unlock it. Meanwhile, the community was gripped by fear. Rumors ran wild. Some believed Traci had been targeted because of someone she knew. Others whispered about a stranger prowling the roads, picking up hitchhikers. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone at night. The Christmas season, normally filled with joy, was instead haunted by grief and suspicion. The media covered the story heavily, putting pressure on investigators. Reporters asked pointed questions. Was the killer still out there? Was the town safe? Could this happen again? Police reassured the public they were doing everything possible, but behind the scenes, the weight of the case pressed down hard. Weeks turned into months, and leads began to dry up. Each promising tip seemed to end in disappointment. Polygraph tests were administered to suspects, but the results were inconclusive. Vehicles were inspected, but none matched perfectly. The case file grew thicker, but clarity remained elusive. Traci's family, devastated by her loss, pushed for answers. They held vigils, shared memories, and pleaded with anyone who might know something to come forward. For them, each day without justice was a fresh wound. Imagine carrying that kind of grief, waking up every morning knowing your daughter's killer was still free, perhaps even walking among you in the grocery store or pumping gas just a few cars over. By the 1-year mark, frustration had settled deep into the investigation. Detectives still followed up on tips, but the momentum was fading. The community, once electrified by fear and anger, began to return to normal routines, at least outwardly. Yet under the surface, the unease never truly left. Then, as often happens in difficult cases, suspicion turned inward. Some wondered if the killer was someone within the community's social circles, someone overlooked because they blended in too well. Police quietly monitored certain men, re-interviewed old witnesses, and sifted through inconsistencies. But once again, no breakthrough came. The case was slowly slipping into the dreaded category no detective ever wants to admit to: a cold case. Years passed. Forensic technology improved, and each time new techniques emerged, Traci's case was revisited. In the late 80s and early 90s, DNA profiling began to revolutionize criminal investigations. Traci's preserved evidence was tested again, and a profile was developed, but it didn't match anyone in the system. The Wisconsin DNA database, still in its infancy, came up empty. Still, detectives refused to give up. They kept the file open, hoping time would eventually bring answers. Traci's family clung to hope as well. They had lost her, but they refused to lose their fight for justice. By the late 1990s, the case had become a painful landmark in Saukville's history, a reminder of evil's reach, but also of persistence. Generations grew up knowing the name Traci Hammerberg, whispered in cautionary tales about safety, about walking alone, about trusting strangers. But even then, no one could have predicted that it would take decades, nearly 35 years, for the truth to finally come to light. By the time the 1990s turned into the 2000s, the murder of Traci Hammerberg had taken on a haunting status in Wisconsin's history. For those who remembered December 1984, the wound never fully healed. For younger generations, her story became a chilling cautionary tale passed down through hushed conversations. Don't walk alone at night. Don't trust the quiet roads, and always remember what happened to Traci. For investigators, the file never gathered dust. Every few years, new detectives took a fresh look, hoping their eyes might catch something overlooked. Leads were re-examined, suspects re-interviewed, and evidence retested as technology advanced. Yet each cycle ended the same way, without an arrest, without justice. But the one piece of evidence that held promise was the DNA. That biological sample, carefully preserved from Traci's body on that freezing night in 1984, remained the case's most valuable clue. By the late 90s, DNA profiling had become sophisticated enough to create a unique genetic fingerprint of the killer. And when investigators tested the evidence, they got a result: a clear profile. It was the key they had been waiting for. But when they ran the profile through the state and national databases, the excitement quickly turned to frustration. No match. The killer was not in the system. He had never been convicted of a crime that required his DNA to be entered. The result was both a gift and a curse. They now knew exactly what his genetic identity looked like, but they couldn't put a name to it. Years slipped by, and the cold case grew colder still. Forensic science marched forward, but still the DNA profile sat unmatched, waiting for a connection that never seemed to come. Detectives retired. New faces joined the force. The story of Traci Hammerberg was passed from one generation of investigators to the next, always with the same reminder: one day, science will catch up. For Traci's family, the decades were brutal. They carried grief like a second skin. Holidays were hollow, birthdays were reminders of what could have been, and every December brought back the chilling anniversary of her death. Imagine being them, knowing the answer was out there, that the killer's identity was preserved in a vial in some evidence locker, but still waking up each day with no name, no face, no justice. By the 2010s, a new revolution in forensics had begun to emerge: genetic genealogy. Instead of relying solely on government DNA databases, investigators started using publicly available genealogical data, sites where people uploaded their DNA to trace family history. These databases weren't created for crime solving, but they became powerful tools for it. If a criminal's relative had uploaded their DNA, investigators could build a family tree and narrow down suspects. This breakthrough method had already cracked several notorious cold cases across the country, including the capture of the Golden State Killer in 2018. For detectives in Wisconsin, it offered a sliver of hope. Could Traci's killer finally be identified using this technology? In 2019, investigators decided it was time to try. They submitted the DNA profile from Traci's case into genealogical databases. Weeks passed. Then, the results came back. And this time, they had a hit. The DNA was linked not directly to a suspect but to relatives. Through painstaking work, genealogists and detectives traced family trees, narrowing the possibilities. Slowly, a name began to rise to the surface. A man who had lived in Wisconsin at the time of the murder, someone whose background fit the profile, someone who had slipped under the radar for decades. His name was Philip Cross. Cross had been just 21 years old in 1984, living in the same region where Traci was killed. He was not on anyone's radar back then, not a major suspect, not a convicted offender, just another face in the crowd. But the DNA evidence was conclusive. The samples recovered from Traci's body all those years ago matched Cross with absolute certainty. It was the breakthrough investigators had been chasing for 35 long years. Science had finally caught up. But there was a cruel twist to the discovery. Philip Cross was dead. He had passed away in 2012, years before his secret was uncovered. He had gone to his grave without ever facing justice, without ever being forced to explain why he had murdered an 18-year-old girl walking home on a December night. For Traci's family, the revelation was bittersweet. On one hand, after decades of torment, they finally had an answer. They knew who killed Traci. They could stop wondering, stop questioning every shadow in their memories. But on the other hand, they would never get the satisfaction of seeing Cross stand trial. He would never face a jury. He would never serve a sentence. He escaped earthly justice, leaving only the cold comfort of his name written into the record of guilt. The announcement of the breakthrough sent shockwaves through Wisconsin. After so many years, people had begun to think Traci's case might never be solved. The power of genetic genealogy had proven once again that time does not erase the truth. Still, for the community, there was anger too. For decades, Cross had lived freely. He had worked jobs, built relationships, and lived a life while Traci's was cut short. The injustice of it all weighed heavy. Imagine knowing the man responsible for such horror had walked among you for decades, perhaps even smiling politely at neighbors, all while carrying the darkest of secrets. But there was also relief. Relief that Traci's name would no longer be followed by a question mark. Relief that her family could finally say, "We know who did this." And relief that future generations would remember her story not as an unsolved mystery, but as an example of perseverance, of the unrelenting pursuit of truth. For investigators, the resolution of Traci Hammerberg's case became a testament to the importance of preserving evidence, no matter how long it takes. Those samples collected in 1984 had endured through decades, waiting for the science to evolve. And when it did, they spoke louder than any witness ever could. After nearly 35 years in the dark, the truth had finally come to light. When the announcement came in 2019 that Philip Cross had been identified as Traci Hammerberg's killer, the room was silent. Law enforcement officers, some of whom had carried this case for decades, stood with tears in their eyes. For them, it was more than just the closing of a file. It was the proof that persistence matters, that no matter how many years pass, there is always hope. For Traci's family, the emotions were complicated. Relief was there, yes, but it was mixed with grief, frustration, and a deep sadness that justice had slipped through their fingers. They had waited 35 years for this name, and when it finally came, it was attached to a man already buried in the ground. Imagine being them, knowing that the person responsible for destroying your world had lived free for decades. He had laughed, eaten meals, celebrated holidays, perhaps even tucked his children into bed, while their daughter's life was reduced to a headstone. That is the cruelest truth of unsolved cases. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, but it often feels that way. The detectives who worked the case echoed that sentiment. Some retired officers admitted that there were nights they couldn't sleep, haunted by the idea that the killer was out there, walking freely. Others said they never stopped replaying the investigation in their heads, wondering if they had missed something. To finally learn the truth was a burden lifted, but also a reminder of how many years had been stolen by silence. The community of Saukville, too, felt the ripple effects. For decades, Traci's murder had been an open wound. Parents warned their children about walking alone. Women carried the weight of fear when driving those dark country roads. And even as the years passed, her story never fully faded from memory. When the case was solved, many locals admitted they cried, not just for the Hammerberg family, but for their younger selves, the teenagers of the 80s who lost their innocence the night Traci was killed. But there was also inspiration in the resolution. Her story became proof that no case is ever truly hopeless. It showed that science, when combined with relentless determination, can give a voice to the silenced. That lesson mattered not just for Wisconsin, but for families across America who still wait for answers. And here's where the guilt sets in. Because while Traci's family finally got closure, thousands of other families are still waiting. Mothers still wake up every morning not knowing what happened to their child. Fathers still sit in silence wondering if the killer lives down the street. Brothers and sisters still carry the pain of birthdays that never come. And too many cases, just like Traci's once was, sit cold in dusty evidence lockers. Her case should remind us all. These families cannot fight alone. If you ever learn something, no matter how small, that could help investigators, do not stay silent. A single tip, a single memory, even a single rumor could be the missing puzzle piece. Silence protects killers. Speaking up protects victims. And for those who think these stories don't matter anymore, remember this. Traci was only 18. She could have been your sister, your daughter, your friend. She could have been anyone. And if it happened to her, it can happen anywhere. When you hear her name, don't just think of the horror. Think of the life she deserved to live and the responsibility we all share to keep stories like hers alive. Today, when you drive through Saukville, you won't see signs of what happened on that cold December night in 1984. The roads are the same, the houses still stand, the snow still falls every winter. But for those who know the story, those streets will never feel the same. For them, every quiet corner is haunted by the ghost of what was lost. And maybe that's how it should be, because remembering keeps her alive. Forgetting is the only way she truly dies. So tonight, as you finish hearing Traci Hammerberg's story, don't just move on. Carry her memory with you. Share her name. Tell her story. And remind yourself that behind every headline, every cold case, there was a person, a bright, laughing, loving person whose future was stolen. Traci Hammerberg was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams. And though her life ended on December 15, 1984, her story will echo for generations. Because justice isn't just about courtrooms or verdicts. It's about remembering, refusing to look away, and promising that their lives mattered. And if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Never assume time erases truth. Because sometimes the truth just waits.